So in this video, what we're going to do is discuss the problems that we face today, but before we get to today, we have to go back in time to be able to know where it started, the very first starting of it. It took me a while to get this timeline together, and the timeline is technically not fully complete, but it's definitely a good start. It's a good skeleton, as my friend puts it. Racism, the assumption of something called white supremacy, immigration, fake hate speech, propaganda, especially in the media, and the dumbing down of people is basically what this will cover and how it came to be. If we look at the front of the timeline, the top of the timeline, we know that May 1st, 1776, which May 1st also, ironically, is a communist day, when all the communists celebrate. There was a man by the name of Adam Weishaupt. He was born a Jew who converted to Catholicism. But he didn't stay in Catholicism. He decided to leave the church after accepting a mission with a lot of money from the House of Rothschilds. And a lot of people call this organization that was formed the Illuminati. Some people take it seriously, some people think it's a joke, others dismiss it, and some people don't even know about it. It doesn't matter what you call it. Whether you think it's the Illuminati of today, what people think of it today, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that a mission was started to create some kind of organization to cause havoc in the world. And you can't deny it, because everywhere you look in the world, there's problems that are made a big deal when either they shouldn't be made a big deal, they really aren't a big deal, or it's fake and easy to debunk. So, after May 1st, 1776, speeding up a couple of years, in 1784, this Weishaupt issued his orders for the French Revolution. He was paid money by the Rothschilds to give money to European countries that participated in the Napoleonic Wars. So, there was a German at the time, Zweig, I believe is how you pronounce the name. All of these plans to have the Napoleonic Wars, to cause havoc, to take control, was put into book form. When it was put into book form, a courier was given this book to take to Paris. But it didn't reach Paris because the courier was killed during a thunderstorm by a lightning strike on his horse. He didn't even get to make it out of Germany. The Bavarian police at the time came across his body, searched him, and found this book. When the police found this book and read through it, they submitted this information to the government, to the Bavarian government. The Bavarian government told the police to raid Weishaupt's house. When they raided his house, they found additional documents, money trail, things of that sort, which was considered additional evidence. When all of this additional evidence was founded, a year later, the Bavarian government outlawed this Illuminati called organization, closed all of their lodges, their meeting spots, buildings, things of that sort. So with this Illuminati group being discovered, as some people call it, they had to find a different name. Now, we have to understand one thing. The name Illuminati has been used way before most people even knew what it meant or even knew of the word, the name. It's been used in so many different societies, organizations, religions, sects, all kinds of different things. It has not always been used in the context that it's used in today. So, when it was used in this context, the name and the organization that was using the name was completely banned. But of course, they weren't going to just stop what they were doing. So, a year later, in 1786, the Bavarian government published the evidence. And this Weishaupt individual ordered his members to infiltrate the Masonic Blue Lodges, especially in the United States, because they knew how powerful the Masons were and what a big society the Masons were. The Masons were actually infiltrated quickly, and a lot of them did not even see it coming. And that is one problem that a lot of people have with Masonry, with Freemasonry. Freemasonry, when it started out, the whole principle of it, and for the longest time, was a really great organization, had great intentions and whatnot, but once the Freemasonry was taken over in secret by this Illuminati group, individuals with bad intentions, it completely just corrupted it. And it still continues like that till today. Most of the people who are Masons and participate in Freemasonry have no idea about this. They have no idea what this is. They have no idea that the things that have changed in the Illuminati were because of this secret society that infiltrated Freemasonry and changed things. Because a lot of things in Freemasonry today are not the same things as back in the 1700s, before this infiltration. Things have changed dramatically in Freemasonry, but the changes aren't really spoken about, so nobody knows. That's why I will not join Freemasonry, because it's been completely corrupted and infiltrated by those who wish to do harm and evil intentions to the world. Now, if we scroll down, in 1789, there were a couple of events. The Napoleonic Wars were, of course, in progress. The point of them was to weaken the French and British governments, which it did, and there was, of course, a lot of casualties. A person by the name of John Robson, he warned that the Illuminati was inside the Masonic Blue Lodges in America. Now, the Rothschilds in 1789, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, told the British government, convinced them that the winner was actually the loser and the loser was actually the winner. And this caused mass chaos in the stock market and the Bank of England, caused it to crash. And so what the Rothschilds did was they created a new Bank of England, which they had control over. And they were able to maintain the money in the English government. That is basically how that happened. And it's still the same Bank of England from that new bank building from the Rothschilds. So, going forward several years, in 1815, there was what they called, the Rothschilds called, Congress in Vienna, which discussed creating a League of Nations. If you're not familiar with what a League of Nations is, or what its intent was, or what it was to look like, just imagine the United Nations today. And that'll sum it up. Same thing, just different name. So they discussed creating a League of Nations to serve as the housing of a one world government. But this plan did not work because in 1815, the Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, completely crashed the plan, exposed it, of a one world government. And of course, a king is not going to, or in this case a czar, a king or any monarchy is not going to allow a one world government to take over their country. They're just not going to. So that's why he completely torpedoed it. In 1826, Captain Morgan, a man by the name of Captain Morgan, informed the Masons of the Illuminati truth, what they were doing, and he identified people behind the plot. There's a lot of good possibility that Thomas Jefferson, our founding father, was involved in this secretly. But I'm still putting together the pieces, but a lot of it certainly looks that way, and it wouldn't surprise me. And Thomas Jefferson, if you think about it, was not really in the same thought process as most of the other Americans. And he believed in a lot of different other things at the time, like multiculturalism, race mixing, marrying a different race, having kids. And that was at the time seen to be wrongful. So he had a different thought process than most people. That's not why I think that he was involved in it, but that just gives you an idea of how different he was than everybody else. So this secret society, we'll call it the Illuminati, convicts this Captain Morgan of treason because Morgan informed everybody of what was actually going on. So the Illuminati assigned a man named Richard Howard to execute him, to assassinate him. But Morgan knew of this assassination plan. So Captain Morgan tried to get out of Dodge, tried to flee, headed up north to Canada. He was going to escape and hide out. However, somehow Howard found out that Morgan was fleeing to Canada. He was able to catch up to him around the border of Canada, the United States-Canadian border. And he caught up to him, and he found him, and he killed him right then and there. So, that is what happened regarding that. In 1830, Weishaupt died after a revised version of what he had written um, was released of the age-old conspiracy, as some call it. Some of these details included things like international organizations working their agents into executive positions, which you see a lot of today. The good old buddy system of people who are friends of those who are big bankers or with some type of ties to the state of Israel or whatever the case may be. You see it all the time. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. In 1834, there was an Italian revolutionary, Giuseppe Mazzini, I believe is how you say his name. It is believed that he was selected by the Illuminati to spread the idea of the Illuminati throughout the world, especially being a revolutionary. I don't know if he ever declared himself as a communist or anything like that, but there's a lot of things that come back to him. So, in 1850, the Illuminati held a meeting in New York. An individual by the last name of Wright, we discovered, was speaking about bringing together atheists with the Illuminati to form a new weapon and scare word called communism. You know how a lot of people hate communism? Most reasonable people do. It would make sense. And then you've got stupid people who love communism and don't know a damn thing about it, but they like the way it sounds, so instead of paying attention to what's happened in history and realizing that it is never worked for any country that has done it, they like it because it sounds good. Communism is not a political tool. It is not a thought process. It is not a government type. It is not a trial and error. It is simply one thing and one thing only, and that is a weapon against people to propagandize people into believing whatever the narrative or narratives are that government wants to push. Put simply, that's communism. Communism is not a real political party or ideology. It is a propaganda weapon to control the masses and make them think what you want them to think. And we see a lot of that today. Not only in the name of communism, but things that resemble communism in a way. Now, still in 1850, individuals by the name of Clinton Roosevelt, Horace Greeley, Charles Dana, they were appointed to head the committee to raise funds for Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which we know those are two of the main players in communism. In order to get their narrative across and for people to like it, they had to pay to propagandize their material. And we all knew that Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx, is just that, propaganda and brainwashing. You read this book, Communist Manifesto, as soon as you read it, if you like it, you know you've been brainwashed. Now, here's something about the Civil War that plays into it that most people don't talk about. Of course, we know the Civil War ended in 1865. Now, with the Civil War ending in 1865, this proved to be an issue for the Rothschilds to be able to clutch the Americans' money system. Now, Before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln planned to gather up all of the slaves, and of course after the war, former slaves, and return them to Africa because it was their homeland. It's where their ancestors were from. It was their true home. It's where they should have been with their own people, not thousands of miles across the sea away from your ancestry and your birthright, your home. So he was going to do that as reparations. Upon them arriving back to Africa, he was going to have companies, individuals, military, things of that sort, rebuild, or I should say build, a whole civilization with them and their ancestry. Build them housing, things of that sort. Housing, running water, things of that sort. Wells, schools, government systems. But a secret society, not the Illuminati, but possibly connected to the Illuminati, caught wind of this. This party was pro-slavery, but they would not admit it out loud. And they hired John Wilkes Booth to assassinate Lincoln to prevent the blacks from being sent back home, because they wanted to keep the blacks here to use them for an evil intention later in history down the road. So that plan for Abraham Lincoln was not able to be carried out because of his assassination. And it's possible that other people might not have known about it, so they might not. That's probably the reason why they didn't execute it. Now, still in 1865, a man by the name of Jacob Schiff, he was a Jewish immigrant born in the house of Rothschild in Germany, arrived in New York. He was sent by the Illuminati to New York for 4 to 5 tasks. Acquire control of the American money system, buy into a banking house, find men who would serve as stooges for the Great Conspiracy, create minority group strife throughout nations between blacks and whites, which unfortunately we see today, create a movement to destroy religion, and seduce Congress to surrender control of the money to the Illuminati conspiracy. And we know that this happened because there was the birth of the Federal Reserve. And if you look at the Federal Reserve and the people who are connected to the Federal Reserve, you'll see that the state of Israel's hands are all over it. I don't hate individuals, I don't hate Jews, nothing like that, but that is just the truth. That is where the hands are. Everybody who is connected to the Federal Reserve from the beginning even to today, you look in and you do a background check. They're either Jewish descent, or all of the above, and has citizenship, dual citizenship with the state of Israel, other than here, Israel. That's just the way it is. I can't help that. But I will not sugarcoat it, and I will not change it, because that's the truth. In 1872, the Mazzini guy that we spoke about earlier, who was supposed to spread this Illuminati idea, he passed away. But First, he chose a man by the name of Adrian Lemmy as his successor. Lemmy succeeded by Lenin, then Trotsky, then Stalin. Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. Those are really important individuals to look up because they even furthered the weapon of communism. Now, in 1890, there were outbreaks of violence in Russia, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. Jews, innocent Jews, attacked by other Jews who were working for the House of Rothschilds. Yes, these Jews killed their own people, but they didn't care. They had to kill them. All these innocent people in these European countries, they had to kill them because they had to blame it on somebody, and they had to make them look like the poor guy who was attacked. And that's exactly what they did. They killed their own people. Disgusting. I don't care if you agree. I don't care if you like or dislike Jews. To kill your own people is disgusting. Period. So since this attack happened, they needed to be refugees. They needed to flee somewhere. Flee persecution. Flee assassination. Things of that sort. They swarmed into the United States. Mainly New York and Chicago. This went on for decades. The refugees were aided by committees set up by the Rothschilds, and they were quickly transformed into naturalized citizens and educated to register as Democrats in their area of residency. And Nelson Aldrich and Woodrow Wilson were key players in letting this happen. Woodrow Wilson, contrary to popular belief with many, was a very dirty, dirty man. And in my opinion, was not a good president. And we'll see later on throughout this why I come to that conclusion. Now, in 1908, Schiff, the Jewish immigrant who came from Germany, who arrived in 1865, but in 1908, he took control of the American money system. Got his hands in it. Kuhn and Loeb. Ever heard of it? Kuhn, Loeb and Company. That was basically what he designed. So he had a lot of control over the money. Interest, firms, things of that, investment firms, things of that sort. Colonel Edward Mandell House. Several individuals met at the Jekyll Island Hunt Club, owned by J.P. Morgan. A week later, they thought of an idea, as I had said earlier, the Federal Reserve System. They wanted to have their hands in the money, and that's exactly what they did. So a year later, in 1909, Schiff helped create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Now here's the thing. Civil rights movement did not happen until the 1950s, 1960s. But in 1908, when there wasn't an outcry for civil rights, in 1909, they created the NAACP. But the NAACP was created by white people who were rich, who had a lot of influence on people, government influence, who were all Jewish men. And they created this organization because they needed to have some type of organization that would basically tell people later down the road, you are, you were spit on, you were disliked, you are lower than everybody in their opinions. You need to create a civil rights movement. You need to throw out all these honkies and whites because it's all their fault. It was a propaganda machine, and it still is today. If you look at the NAACP board of directors, everyone who's in charge of the NAACP, they're not black people. Why is that? That's kind of racist, if you ask me, to create an organization to advance, promote, defend, protect black people, but you don't let any of the high supreme commanders, officers, directors of that organization be black people. Blacks represent by blacks. No, you make it all white people. You only let white people be in control of a black organization. That right there is very sketchy to me, and I don't think that's right. The NAACP is nothing more than a propaganda machine. They don't actually help black people like they say they want to. They don't, that's not their primary mission. Primary mission is to put propaganda into black people's minds, corrupt them, and make them think that old whitey's out to get them and that white people just need to die. It still goes on today. Of course, they won't publicly say that, but I mean, you really can't name much that the NAACP has done for large success. Because if the NAACP helped the black community like they say they do, and has given the black community so much success, then why do they still say that the black community is oppressed, is not as high as everybody else, needs free handouts and government assistance and free jobs and affirmative action and all this other stuff? If the NAACP truly elevated the black community to be better and great people, which many of them are, but to be great as a culture, if they really did that, then there would be no outcry of oppression. That's simple, because it would be successful, especially having an organization that's nationwide. So that right there just goes to prove that the NAACP hasn't done anything to help the black community. And it's sick, because like I said, it's a weapon. In 1910, Zangwill wrote a famous play. Israel Zangwill wrote a famous play called The Melting Pot. You've probably heard of this. And it was also a time period, too, called The Melting Pot. It falsely portrayed the American people discriminating and persecuting the Jewish and black people. Now, don't get me wrong. And around that time frame, Jewish people were getting discriminated against. Black people were getting discriminated against. But not to the degree that this play portrayed it. Then, as there's an individual named Israel Cohen, he wrote a book called The Racial Tension. That outlined the plan of using the tension to gain black culture control, to gain black people control, create white guilt. I have seen so much of that crap online. Oh, I'm white. I'm so full of guilt. Help me. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Forgive us. Forgive us for what we've done. I'm not going to apologize for something that I wasn't involved in and wasn't even alive at the time, and no one else should either. No one these days is owed any reparations, and no one these days offers anyone an apology, because none of us, nor were our grandparents, alive during the Civil War or before to even give for the appropriate person to give the reparations and the appropriate people to receive those reparations. Neither one of those groups are alive. So it's over with. It's in history. Changes have been made for the good. But the racial tension book, the melting pot play, the NAACP, all pushes the narrative that it doesn't matter if the white people were alive back then. The white people alive today were not alive back then. They're still white, so they still owe you. Even though you weren't alive back then and you weren't oppressed or a slave, they still, because their skin is white, owe you today because of your ancestors. It doesn't work that way. They like to portray it that way. It doesn't work that way. It'd be a lot different. But remember, this so-called Illuminati group, or this other secret society with John Wilkes Booth, already destroyed the plan of giving reparations to the black community. They destroyed it. Since they destroyed it, there were no reparations except the freeing of slaves. The freeing of the slaves at the end of the Civil War. That was it. That was really it. Would have been more, but they stopped it. So they kind of just shot themselves in the foot, but they liked shooting themselves in the foot because it was pain that they could use later down the road. But you didn't get any reparations, and neither did your ancestors. So you got to get them now, and we got to change these street names with all these white people's names on them because of the Civil War. It's as I've said before. There's talks of wanting to change the city of Austin, Texas name because Stephen F. Austin was a white guy who had slaves around the time of the Alamo. How dare he? You cannot hold anyone of a different culture and time period to the standards of today. I don't care how evil, how bad, how oppressed, it doesn't matter. You cannot hold someone of a different time, in a different culture, in a different lifestyle that was not as hated on back then as it is today to today's standards. It makes no sense because today's standards were not the standards back then. It was more of a cultural norm back in those days for people to have slaves. It was not frowned upon as widely as it was today. Many people had slaves. It was normal for someone to have a slave back in the day. So you can't take someone back living in that time period with those cultural norms and compare them and make them have to stand up and accept today's cultural norms. It doesn't work that way. So the whole removing Confederate statues, removing Confederate flags, renaming cities, renaming parks, renaming streets, because back then when it was normal, but it's not normal today, you still got to change it. That doesn't make any sense. It does not make any sense. Things have been changed for the better today. We move forward and we make progress. But we do not drag the past into today and say, oh, well, about 100, 150 years ago, that famous historic person had slaves. And because today it's frowned upon and illegal, but he did it back then, we got to hold him to today's standards. That does not make any sense. And they're not even alive today to even defend themselves or even talk about it. So that's an even dumber reason to hold them to today's standards. You can't do it. The only reason why they do it is because it makes their agenda look good. Period. I don't care who you are, what you look like, what your color is, who was oppressed, who wasn't oppressed, and all this other stuff. It doesn't matter. Move forward, make progress. That's all you need to be focused on. Period. Now, in 1912, Woodrow Wilson was elected as president. Senator Aldrich railroaded the Federal Reserve Act through both House of Congress, the House and the Senate. But several congressmen who were against it were out of town. They had to shove this Federal Reserve Act as fast as they could down the United States people's throats. And that's exactly what they did. Federal Reserve Act. Federal Reserve Act, in my opinion, and to many others too, is completely illegal and unconstitutional. There is no need for the Federal Reserve, but there is a need because that's part of the agenda. So, in 1913, a year later, Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act and the 16th Amendment into law. As I've said here, it goes against Article 1, Section 8, defining powers of Congress. These involve the plot outlined in the Federal Reserve Conspiracy. That's also a book that you can get by Eustace Mullins. You should look it up. Created tax-free foundations, which enabled avoiding payment of income tax based on humanitarian philanthropy. Now, in 1913, the NAACP, that was only one weapon and false organization that was created. We also have what we have today, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, who spends their whole time and all these years of coming up with, that's offensive, that's offensive, that's offensive, that's offensive, that's racist, that's defamation right there. That is wrong. And telling the whole world and the whole nation that you have to go by our standards because we said that this is wrong, racist, should be illegal, is discriminatory. Just because we said it was, you have to accept that. Now, the ADL is another Gestapo for their conspiracy. ADL leadership is controlled by the NAACP leadership. Martin Luther King was a big pusher in this. Not saying that Martin Luther King was an evil man, but Martin Luther King did have a lot of communist type of thoughts. Some people even say that he was a registered communist, American communist. Could be. I wouldn't be surprised if he was. So the ADL gained control of advertising budgets of department stores, hotel chains, and TV and radio sponsors. Controlling the media, just like today. See? It just slides right on in and fits. Now, in 1914, World War I, it was funded by this Illuminati group, by the Rothschilds again. They had to create a war that would create so much distress, so much of an outcry to demand that we all come together as one world, one government, that we never have wars again. They had to create some kind of event that would be so tragic that people would call and beg for a one world government. So they funded World War II. How did they do this? They paid someone to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's exactly what they did. And they needed to destroy the Tsar of Russia. Because again, as we said before, And Alexander I torpedoed the League of Nations idea. You cannot have a czar or a monarchy running and have a one world government. It will not work because they will clash with one another. And then, of course, later down the road, we know about the assassination of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. Woodrow Wilson, when he was on the campaign trail, one of his slogans was, "Re-elect the man who will keep your sons out of the war." But what did we do in 1917? During World War I, what did Wilson do? He threw the United States military into World War I. The Republicans had warned that Wilson had long committed himself to throw the U.S. into the war, which he did. So he was reelected, and again, as I said, in 1917, forced the U.S. into World War I by using the sinking of the Lusitania as an excuse. There's a good chance that the Lusitania was sunk on purpose as part of the plot. As we know, corruption can get very, very disgusting. And it most likely did. And that was probably a big player in it. So, as we know, the Bolshevik Revolution, which was basically the screams and demands of communism in Russia, were funded by Trotsky, who was funded by Schiff here in the United States. $20 million in gold with 300 Russian Jewish refugees in New York were loaded up on a boat and sailed to Switzerland to meet with Lenin. Now, their goal was to assassinate the Romanovs, which they did. And strangely, in attendance to their meeting was this Colonel Edward Mandell House. Here he is showing up again. Now, while they were en route from New York to Switzerland, there was a British warship that intercepted this ship with all this $20 million in gold and these 300 Russian Jewish refugees who were basically hired to become Bolshevik revolutionaries. The British warship intercepted them. Schiff sent a message to Wilson: order the British to release the ship intact, or the U.S. would not enter the war. So Woodrow Wilson broke off all diplomatic relations with Germany, and these Jews with Trotsky, all of them were loaded up into rail cars, smuggled into Russia. And that right there was the beginning of the birth of the Bolshevik Revolution that took over Russia, made it communist. In 1918, Rothschilds created the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. That was the headquarters of their conspiracy. Schiff dispatched Colonel House to Moscow with orders to Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin to change the name of the regime to the Communist Party and to adopt Karl Marx's manifesto as the constitution of the Communist Party, which it is today. Everybody knows communism does not work, and it will not work. It looks beautiful on paper, but you name me one country that it has truly been success in. Not only that, but communism really hasn't even able to be fully achieved. Normally, countries that have tried to become communist normally fall so short and collapse while they're still in socialist phase. You really cannot complete the communism. You just can't. It will not work. Looks like it will work, but it doesn't. Communism is disgusting. Now, Congressman Henry Lodge completely unmasked Wilson's plan to join the League of Nations at the end of World War I. They tried it. He was able to shut it down in Congress. Wilson also had found difficulty in convincing the American people to accept the idea. She did. So Schiff ordered Colonel House and the Bernard Baruch to organize a council on foreign relations, which still, of course, exists today. In 1935, a pamphlet published by the American Communist Party entitled Negroes in a Soviet America. You can look this up. You can find it. They published a book called Negroes in a Soviet America, which urged Negroes to rise in the South and apply for admission in the Soviet Union. It claimed that it would be supported by the American Reds and liberals. Now, if you look at this book, page 38 states the Soviet government would confer great benefits to these people because they were black. Any act of violence or discrimination would be a crime under the revolutionary law. No discrimination. So a lot of them bought into it. Well, I'm a black person. I'm so tired of being discriminated against. They're going to make it a law for someone to even just not like me. They make it illegal. So they bought into it. And this is in Cohen's book that we spoke of previously. Page 38. It was an official edit of the Communist Party. So in 1939, the Illuminati founded, they needed another war, because remember, the League of Nations after World War I was completely demolished. They didn't like the idea. So they needed to try it again. So they funded another war, World War II, against Hitler's Germany. Caused hatred against German people and their political system, blaming it on Germany's reclaim of Poland. There were Germans in Poland who wanted to be reunited with Germany. But Poland wasn't playing that game. So Germany invaded Poland to get those Germans that were stuck in Poland back in that area. I'm not a neo-Nazi or anything like that, but again, this is just plain history that nobody wants to talk about. Nobody wants to teach this version of history because it doesn't fit in the agenda. Anything I say, anything I found in this, you can easily find it yourself. You just have to dig for it. Eventually you'll find it. So in 1940, Roosevelt ran on the same campaign slogan: I will never send our boys into a war on foreign soil. Well, what did Roosevelt do in 1941? He dragged the United States into World War II. And some people would disagree with this, but I think he enticed Japan into the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor because of the Embargo Act against Japan, because Japan needed the oil reserves off the coast of Japan. And we put an Embargo Act in it. Japan, because of their military, their country needed that oil. They couldn't get it. So what did they do? Possibly retaliated because of that against the United States. So international communism was to be built up until equaled in strength with the United Christendom. And when it reached that point, it was to be contained until required for the final social cataclysm. President Roosevelt applied a 20% withholding tax on all small wage earners and up to 90% on higher incomes. Now, he claimed that it was only going to be for the duration of World War II, but it went on longer than that. In 1943, the framework for the United Nations was created, handed to Roosevelt. New York City was to be chosen as the nursery. Rockefellers donated the land for the United Nations building, and the United Nations building was built in New York with Rockefellers' money. You know, that is awfully interesting for just some average Joe who's got a lot of money to give his money to a bunch of countries to build a building for them all to gather in it. The Rockefellers were not politicians. They were businessmen. And for a businessman to spend that much money on a building for the United Nations, for countries and politics, that's shady as hell. And anyone who can't see that as shady, it's got another thing coming. In 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin put the policy into effect. The State of Israel was created by the Zionists, the Illuminati, covered up by blaming the National Socialist Party, the Nazis. Now, this gets very controversial at this point, because there is no proof that the 6 million people who died during the Holocaust were all Jews. In fact, the number 6 million didn't even come up until about the 1950s, 1960s. 10, 15 years after the end of World War II. I'm not saying that the Holocaust is a myth. I'm not saying that people who died during the Holocaust, were a small number. I'm not saying that. But there is no proof that the number 6 million was only, and it can't be proven, because Jews were not the only ones in concentration camps. You had Polish people there. You had homosexuals there. You had gypsies there. You had non-whites there. And they did not wear stars because they were all in the gray striped pajamas, as many people refer to the uniform, the inmate uniform. So the number 6 million for only being Jews cannot be proved. If you want to say 6 million in total of people who were there, that's fine. But there is no proof that it was 6 million specifically Jews. So that right there is very controversial, but I cannot find proof. And anything that claims to be proof that it was 6 million only Jews cannot be proven. It cannot be true proof, because there's no way to identify them as being specifically Jew or not. I don't agree with genocide, but I do not agree with propaganda either. So a phony United Nations conference, still in 1945, was set up in San Francisco. Representatives of 50 nations gathered there. The attendees signed the charter, which was sent to the U.S. Senate, who signed the charter without even reading it. And thus, at that point, the United Nations was formed in an attempt to eventually one day create, after a World War III, war of all wars, which is supposed to be the most traumatic, for everybody to eventually beg the United Nations to become a one world government, take over the world. What they'll get out of it, other than just propagandizing, brainwashing people, I do not know. Maybe a deal with the devil, I don't know. But that's the plan, just to have control. They want to have control of everything. They want people to be robots. So, whatever you learn in history class, you should check the sources and then check those sources. There's a lot of corruption and a lot of shady people in the world these days. And they do not have any good intentions. So be careful and watch your back and pay attention to what happens in governments, politics, news, current events. Mark my words. If we don't do something about this now and elect the right people to defend what we have left of a nation, there will be a World War III. And people will look up and beg and say, United Nations, please make us one. And they will be screwed at that point. This is not a conspiracy theory, because the proof is right here in the pudding. It's a conspiracy, not a conspiracy theory. It's a theory. It is not a theory. It is a conspiracy. This is what their plan is. So be careful is all I can say. And good luck. And be ready for anything to happen. Thank you for watching.